Welcome to a new edition of the Neon Jazz interview series with veteran jazz pianist, composer, and arranger Tim Raitt. He talked about his newest 2020 CD called Excursions and Adventures, and he was joined by Berklee School of Music alumni, drummer Teri Lynne Carrington, and bassist John Patitucci. This is yet another project with his name on it, but he has spent years playing behind pop stars like Lyle Lovett, Aretha Franklin, Bonnie Raitt, and he is best known as Tony Bennett's current pianist and musical director. Over his very long and interesting career, he has been on over 100 recordings, and he's been all over the world. He's even performed at the White House, the Kennedy Center, and the 1992 Presidential Inauguration, The Tonight Show, Late Show with David Letterman, The Conan O'Brien Show, and many other national TV and radio broadcasts. So please get to know his rich story and dig this interview, my friends.
Hey, Tim, thank you for taking a minute out for Neon Jazz today, man.
Yeah, no problem. Glad to do it.
I really, really enjoy Excursions and Adventures. You got a great power lineup, kind of a Berklee alumni, so to speak. So I just want to know from you, what was your vision, your feeling with going into this project?
I was really excited to get to do a recording with John and Teri Lynne. Yeah, we all have the Berklee connection. Well, we all teach here. I teach piano. Teri Lynne teaches drums and has a whole program around women in jazz, which is really great. Yeah, really groundbreaking stuff. And then John Patitucci comes. He doesn't live in Boston, lives in New York, but he comes up about once a month and does like a residency with bass students in the ensemble. So we all have this Berklee connection. We've done stuff on campus, over the years, but never really had done any kind of a trio thing, just the three of us. So I was very excited when they both said, "Yeah, let's do it." So that's kind of the getting us together again through the Berklee connection. We talked a little bit about music, about repertoire. I talked also with Neil Weiss, who runs the Whaling City Sounds label. We came up with some ideas. I wanted to do, of course, some original music, some of mine. I wanted to do at least one of Teri Lynne's songs and one of Patitucci's songs to kind of represent their voice as composers. And then we also kind of, of course, we wanted to do a few standards and jazz tunes that people would recognize. But we also had the idea of doing some pop stuff. And of course, both of those players have got incredible credentials, outside of the jazz world as well as in, of course. So so we kind of came up with this idea for sort of a diverse, at least in terms of material, kind of a diverse collection of songs, and I'm really happy with how it turned out.
You tend to kind of play more of a group kind of accompaniment kind of a thing in your career. So you've had some discs as a leader. Does it always feel good to have your name stamped on it? Is it something you're getting used to? How do you feel about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because I've thought of myself as, over my career, as more of a sideman, more of an accompanist. I do a lot of work with vocalists. I'm out with Tony Bennett a lot right now, but I've also done Lyle Lovett and Jane Sidbury and tons of other vocalists, as well as ensemble things. So yeah, I feel like my identity is more grounded as a sideman. But so I guess the answer to your question is I'm kind of getting used to it. I like the idea of having myself out there and having my name on the front of the CD or whatever, but yeah, it's not something I do all the time. It's something that I'm getting more and more comfortable with, and again, I really enjoy it. But it's still, despite the fact I'm not a young guy, it's still kind of a new thing for me to be out there and presenting my own music and presenting my own group. So it's pretty fun for me.
So let's go to the beginnings of your life. Talk to me a little bit about your childhood. Where were you born and raised, and how did you get involved with jazz?
So I actually grew up in Phoenix, Arizona. Although I've lived most of my life now in Boston, but yeah, I grew up in Phoenix, Arizona. Studied classical music like a lot of little kids, taking piano lessons. But I was also the kind of kid that would love to play by ear, and love to pick up songs off of the radio, and basically anything I was hearing, I was trying to absorb and make it happen on a piano. So that was the beginnings. In high school, I became aware of jazz music. Like a lot of high schools, Sadly not as many today as there were back in the 70s, but a lot of high schools were, doing jazz bands and stage bands, and the high school in Phoenix I went to was one of them. And so I started getting into the style and into the idea of improvisation, and both the style of jazz and the idea of improvisation were really eye-opening for me. And so, found myself a local teacher in Phoenix, and, a local jazz musician named Charles Lewis, who showed me a lot of stuff, turned me on to, some of the great, Oscar Peterson and Bill Evans and so many of the, the great jazz players. And that really kind of got me hooked. And so, by the time I was a college student, I was still playing some classical music, but was really kind of focusing more on jazz. Did an undergraduate degree in jazz at Arizona State, which is the local university close to where I lived. I had a good jazz program. And then after that, decided, and I was doing a lot of local gigs in Phoenix, again, with a lot of singers, as well as just doing some instrumental stuff. And then kind of felt like I needed to get out of Phoenix and, put my toes in a bigger pond, so to speak. So moved out to Boston, did some more college out there at New England Conservatory, and just kind of went from there. I didn't really have I've never felt the need to leave. A lot of my friends, went to school in Boston and ended up moving to New York, and I certainly consider that from time to time. But I just love the city of Boston too much, and loved the scene out there, and what I was doing, in terms of professionally. Ended up getting the teaching job at Berklee College, and so that was another reason to kind of keep me in Boston. And so that's kind of the early days. Yeah, as I said, I've lived in Boston most of my life at this point, but I do a lot of traveling, so I don't feel like I'm missing out on anything.
So what jazz musicians were you really getting into when you were sinking your teeth into jazz?
Yeah, well, I mentioned Oscar Peterson. He was kind of, my teacher back when I was a high school kid. He was very into Oscar, and so he really kind of turned me onto that. And as a guy coming from classical music, that really appealed to me because, of course, his virtuosity and his sound and his touch were just so appealing to me. So he was kind of my sort of my gateway piano player into the jazz world. But pretty quickly, discovered Bill Evans, kind of the pianists who were really kind of, doing some groundbreaking stuff back in the 70s. Which, of course, I think of Herbie, and I think of Chick Corea and Keith Jarrett. Those three were kind of probably my biggest influences through my college years. I was just absorbing everything I could from Herbie and Keith and Chick Corea, and also exploring, because I wanted to, obviously become more of a well-rounded musician. So I was going back in time and, checking out Bud Powell and checking out Errol Garner and Art Tatum, and so trying to get and I love playing stride styles, some of the older jazz piano styles, from the 30s and then earlier. So I was kind of going that direction, but obviously kind of looking into the more contemporary stuff too. So that was a lot of it. Certainly. Once I got to Boston, I started really checking out Danilo Perez and Kenny Werner. Fred Hirsch was a big influence. He was also a teacher of mine at the New England Conservatory, Fred was. And I'm still discovering players every day. I'm sure you play a lot of great pianists on your program, and I listen to jazz radio, and I'm like, oh, I got to check out this guy, and I go, oh, there's another guy I got to check out. There's always somebody new coming up that's doing something amazing. So I feel like I'm still learning.
Absolutely. So, you've played with a lot of people in your life, but I think you spent a lion's share of your time with Tony Bennett. So my question to you is, Tony and even others that have been legends in this craft, what have you learned from the masters? What have they taught you? Things that have been residuals that have made you do what you do?
Ooh, yeah, good question. It's funny. I mean, Tony Bennett's kind of the name person artist that I'm traveling with right now. I think for me, the thing that I've learned so much about from Tony is just how to present a song, how to communicate a song, because he's doing standard tunes, some of the same tunes he recorded, 40, 50 years ago. He's doing a lot of that material, and audiences love that. The standard Great American Songbook, I think, because is the term a lot of people use, that material. And, you know, and I've played those songs for most of my career as a jazz artist. But I think, you know, working with Tony and other artists of his kind give me a little bit better appreciation for some of the deeper meanings of these songs. You know, obviously understanding the lyrics, the way he communicates the lyrics, the way he tells the story. You know, I think oftentimes when I'm performing with him, it's like, yeah, I mean, I'm not a singer, of course, I'm just an instrumentalist, but I need to find a way to communicate the story of this song, you know, whether it's, you know, My Funny Valentine or Love Is Here to Stay or, you know, any of these songs that I've played, you know, hundreds of times, but I need to find a better way to communicate the story the way that an artist like Tony Bennett does. I think the same is true for some of the singer-songwriters that I've worked with. You know, again, it's a different language, it's a different style for the most part, but it's the same idea of like they're communicating a song, they're communicating, you know, an idea, maybe an emotion, and it's like, and that's really, I think, you know, I think the more I grow as an artist myself, the more I'm learning the importance of communicating this kind of story, this kind of emotion. So I think that's kind of a primary message that I'm learning right now. I mean, there's certainly been plenty of other lessons I've learned over the years, you know, playing with great artists, just about, you know, how to, you know, conduct yourself on stage, how to, you know, put a show together, you know, how to engage the audience, those kinds of things. So I'm certainly learning a lot about that too. But yeah, there's so many great lessons to learn from artists, you know, people like Tony Bennett who've been doing it at a high level for so long.
Yeah, without a doubt. So you've been on the stage a lot. You've performed in front of a lot of people. What was one of the first live jazz shows you saw that really blew you away?
Excuse me, that's a good question. You know, it's funny. I think the first jazz concert that I went to, when I was probably early teens in Arizona, in Phoenix, there was a concert of the great Errol Garner, who at this point was getting up there in years. But he did a solo piano concert at like an art center outside of Phoenix, and I don't even think my parents really understood like how important he was as a jazz pianist, but they thought, oh yeah, here's this guy who's really revered, and you know, maybe our son would like to go check him out. And that to me was, again, I was just starting to become aware of jazz music and improvised music, and to me that was just like, wow, this guy is so, and again, you know, he wasn't a young guy either, but he was just, you know, so compelling as a pianist and as an artist, and doing these great renditions of tunes. Of course, Misty was his big hit, and I knew that song, but I didn't know a lot of the other songs that he was playing. But I recognized some of them, and I'm like, wow, he's just doing such amazing things with these melodies and these harmonies and improvising, and it was just really, yeah, it was really incredible. So I'll never forget that Errol Garner concert, solo piano concert. That was really the first one I went to as a youngster. You know, and then I started kind of seeking out other opportunities. You know, of course, I went to a lot of local jazz gigs in the Phoenix area, including some of the ones that my teacher was playing. I started going to like some of the artists that were coming through there. Not all the artists would come through Arizona on their tours, but I did get to see Pat Metheny. I got to see Al Jarreau. This is all while I was living in Arizona. So yeah, those, you know, so I got to, yeah, I did get to see a fair amount of artists come through. Wynton Marsalis did a great concert in the 80s. So yeah.
What do you like best about being a live performer?
You know, I think for me it's I guess it's two things really. One is just the you know, just the interaction with the audience. I mean, it's certainly, you know, as jazz musicians and I'm certainly aware this as a teacher as well, you know, we spend a lot of time in a room practicing, or, you know, or hopefully getting together with friends in a room and you know, jamming and stuff like that, and that's great. But it's always a little different when you're in front of an audience, even if it's, you know, even if it's just, you know, a dozen people of, you know, in a local club. It's a different energy. It's a different kind of experience. You know, it's great. I mean, I love recording too, you know, in a studio, but again, it's never the same. And I always say this to my students, and I'm always reminded of this when I listen to recordings, even of some of my favorite artists. the recordings can be great and instructive, but it's never the same, and it's never quite the same, has the same immediacy as the live performance in front of an audience. Because, like I say, the energy of the audience is always, for me, kind of helped feed my I guess just creativity and feed what it is that I'm trying to do. I like to take chances, as I think most jazz artists do, musically speaking. Take chances and try things, and it's like sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work, and it's okay either way. You get to try something out, and it's just like, yeah, it's always different when you try it out in front of an audience, and so that's really mostly, I think, it's the audience interaction that speaks to me as a live performer.
I want to know this. Everyone has a perception of you, your family, your friends, your fans, but you know yourself best. You live your life. Who do you think you are?
Oh, big question. Yeah. Well, I think for me it's interesting. I mentioned earlier I think of myself as I mentioned I was thinking sort of label myself as kind of a sideman, and in terms of personality, I think I have a little bit of that. I'm not an extroverted person. I tend to be kind of an introverted, quiet person. Tend to spend a lot of time thinking and listening and by myself. So I think for me, when I think of who I am, I tend to think of sort of, again, a quiet, thoughtful person who probably has the best chance of expressing himself. I'm not great with words. Has the best chance of expressing himself and what he's feeling and what he's thinking in terms of music. That's sometimes my wife sometimes jokes that's kind of my first language is music, and English is sort of a second language. But I think there's some truth to that. So that's kind of how I think of myself. Certainly, I think of myself as someone who's trying to, in any kind of musical setting, trying to, contribute to the greater good, make some kind of a statement, but be part of a team. And I think a lot about that as a musician. But I think in terms of my life too, how can I contribute to the world in a way that has an effect and yet doesn't necessarily draw a lot of attention to myself. I think that's I think that's kind of my nature, I suppose you would say. But, I also think of myself as a pretty funny person as well. And generally speaking, I think I have a pretty good time with life, and certainly with music I do. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's just some thoughts. Yeah. Yeah,
totally. It does. I got one final question for you to wrap everything up, and it's this. You're an educator, you're a performer, you release albums, you're kind of all over in this jazz world. How is jazz doing in 2020 as far as you're concerned?
Good question. Yeah, well, certainly it's much different environment than when I was coming up. And some of that I think is just sort of the nature of the music in general. I mean, of course, we all know the changes, that have happened, kind of people getting away from physical recordings into streaming and digital technology. So that certainly, I think, has influenced jazz, although, like I say, that's a phenomenon music-wide. It's not just particular to jazz. But that certainly has had an influence, I think. Generally speaking, I still feel optimistic about the art form of jazz in this country and in the world. I think, certainly, again, you mentioned as a teacher, I mean, performer and teacher, certainly as a teacher, I see plenty of examples of talented young kids who are finding their own way. I mean, sometimes it's tricky because certainly at a school like Berklee, which has got a lot of students, there become times when you go, I don't know where all these kids are going to find gigs. There's more kids in school than there are gigs to be had. But what encourages me about that is that, but they're all most of them I think are finding their own path, finding their own way, into music and into jazz, whether it's as a composer or an accompanist or whatever it is they're into. So I still feel pretty optimistic about jazz as an art form. I mean, it's never going to be pop music, and I think that was answered decades ago. That question was answered decades ago. So it's always just going to be in a niche. But I think there's always going to be an audience, and I think there's always going to be people who want to play it and create this music. And so as long as that's the case, I think it's still viable. I still feel good about it. You just have to be willing and able to make the changes as they come along. So that's how I feel about it.
Right on. Tim, that's great. That's a great way to wrap everything up. Thanks for taking a minute out for Neon Jazz. Good luck with the album and everything in your career, man. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. It's great to talk with you. Thanks.
Thanks for listening and tuning in to another Neon Jazz interview, where we give you a bit of insight into the finest cats in Phoenix, Boston, Kansas City, and spots all over the world, giving fans all that jazz. And thanks to Tim for his time, music, and cool. If you want to hear more interviews, go to Famous Interviews with Joe Domino in the iTunes Store. Visit Neon Jazz at youtube.com, and for everything Neon Jazz all the time, go to the neonjazz.blogspot.com. Until next time, enjoy the jazz, my friends.
Neon Jazz.